Ubisoft games have always been known for pretty subpar performance on launch day, and even down the road, some of them haven't managed to improve all that much even after years of patches and improvements, supposedly anyways. So Ghost Recon Wildlands is of course something that has come under a ton of criticism on the PC release. I am going to be entirely honest, I'm not really sure how the game performs on consoles because that's not really relevant to me, but today I'll be focusing on the PC release of the game and my experience with it as of late, or well, basically I bought it on launch day. Okay, I did the thing that no one's supposed to do. But regardless of that, I bought it pretty much as soon as it was released and started playing it right away. And while I have to say that Ubisoft has improved their optimization practices to some extent, there are still some issues that I would like to address and some things that I want to sort of point out to people who are considering purchasing this game on PC, so that way, you can make a semi-informed purchasing decision. Now, of course, this is just my experience from what I've seen on the Steam forums. This experience can vary greatly from person to person, so your mileage may vary to some extent, but this is just what I have experienced. And of course, the gameplay in the background was captured with NVIDIA Shadow Play at 1440p 60 FPS. Of course, the game does dip below 60 FPS at certain points, but that isn't at the fault of Shadow Play. I will mention that its performance is kind of varied. It really depends on the given time that you're playing the game, because for some reason the game will sometimes run consistently at 60 FPS. I have it locked at 60 FPS, and sometimes the game will run perfectly at that for hours on end, and sometimes it just can't. Like, you might restart the game and all of a sudden it's working perfectly fine when 10 minutes ago it was running like dog shit. So one thing to keep in mind is perhaps the first time you launch up the game and you optimize your settings and stuff, you might want to close the game and restart it, or perhaps even restart your PC. I've read in numerous places that can improve performance for some people, but it does seem to be kind of hit or miss because, as I said, sometimes I'll boot up the game and it runs great, and sometimes I'll boot up the game and it doesn't, and that's with no settings changes in between. So for starters, what I'm just going to briefly touch on the specs that I'm running this on. It's not like fucking god tier or anything, but it is definitely more than adequate to play this game, running an i7 6700K at 4.5 gigahertz and a GTX 1070, which is, stock clock, blah, 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 whatever. And then with 32 gigs of RAM, although I noticed that the game typically doesn't go over 8 gigs, 9 gigs of RAM usage, so you don't need that much. You could probably get away with 8 gigs of RAM, but I'm not really sure since the game did hover around 9 to 10 gigs at certain points. Now, also one thing to keep in mind is if you are running an AMD card, there are some NVIDIA specific effects that this game has. Unfortunately, I mean, they look nice and all, but really, are we still fucking doing this shit? Can we just get these fancy physics and all that stuff working on everybody's GPUs? I've been running NVIDIA for years, but still, it would be nice if there was all this stuff in these games that, just ran for everyone. That would be fantastic. So one of the things to note then is the more heavy, the more intensive NVIDIA specific option being those turf effects. For starters, when toggling between the two and looking at vast fields of grass and whatnot, I didn't notice much in terms of visual changes. In the pause menu, when you're looking at the video settings, it does show you exact comparisons and little screenshots of things being on or off or whatever, which is really nice, and I wish more games would do that. But in actual practice, a lot of these settings that I noticed that were NVIDIA specific, I couldn't really tell the difference even after rebooting the game. Initially, I thought since a lot of physics games require you to restart the game for those effects to take effect, I thought that perhaps maybe you just had to reboot the game, and that was not the case. They just really don't make that much of a difference, but damn, do they make a difference in the performance side. Now, it's not so much of an impact that I've noticed on my 1070 because, it's a fairly powerful card, but on lower end NVIDIA cards, I could see the turf effects and, say, HBAO Plus making a pretty big difference. But so that's just something you should keep in mind. If you want to disable those, they don't make a huge amount of difference. The biggest difference of any NVIDIA effect in this game would be the ambient occlusion, the HBAO Plus, because that, it actually looks really fucking nice, but it definitely has a significant impact on performance, especially at 1440p. So with my current build, it's pretty obvious to me that my GPU is the bottleneck. Like I said, it's a good GPU, but it's definitely not the, best, most highly performing thing on the market, and this game is also not the most optimized thing ever. It's definitely better than Watch Dogs 2, but it's not nearly as good as, say, perhaps The Division has become. Division has actually made leaps and bounds in the performance side of things, so I have to give them credit there. When that game launched, it was a fucking mess in that regard, but this game sort of falls somewhere in the middle between Watch Dogs 2 and The Division, where in certain instances, it seems like my CPU is bottlenecking the system, or very near bottlenecking the system, because if I keep Task Manager open and I'm looking at CPU performance, it's topping out around 85-90% CPU usage, even with that overclock. So while I'm pretty sure that's not ultimately what is bottlenecking this game's performance, it's very, very close. So if you are running a lower end CPU, just keep that in mind. I'm not sure which specific settings would be letting, putting a little bit more load on your GPU than your CPU, but it seems like this game tends to hit both of them pretty hard in the same way that The Division did when it launched, and the same way that Watch Dogs 2 still does. They never fucking optimized that shit. And of course, perhaps that is a bit of a different scenario for me since I'm running it at 1440p, and I know a lot of people still run games at 1080p, but that is just my experience. I might go ahead and drop it down to 1080p at some point in the near future just to test that and see if there's any sort of major difference there other than, taking a bit of load off the GPU. But for the time being, 1440p, that's what I'm going to be going off of. So if you're running a 1080p setup with something very similar in terms of specs, then you can pretty much just expect fairly significantly better performance, since that's a fairly big resolution jump. Now, like I said earlier in the video, there seem to be issues with restarting the game, sometimes causing the performance to greatly improve, especially off of the first launch of the game when you first install it and run it and then customize your settings to however you prefer. Restarting the game can make a significant difference, where sometimes I'll see my game hovering around 50-55 FPS at pretty close to maximum settings, and then I'll go and reboot it and come back 10 minutes later and play it again, and all of a sudden I'm getting a solid 60 throughout, which is a very interesting thing to have happening, considering that's proving that, well, the hardware I have is very capable of running the game at a solid 60 FPS all the time, and yet the software is clearly not optimized to the point where it is able to do it every time for some reason. So that's, the verdict is still out on why that is, but if you just go and scroll through the discussions tab on the Wildlands community hub on Steam, you can see tons of people reporting this issue. Some people saying that restarting the game solves all their problems, some people saying that it does absolutely nothing, and then there's me, where I sit smack dab in the middle, where sometimes restarting the game will increase performance, sometimes it will have no effect whatsoever. And then, of course, you've got the people who are running around complaining that this game looks like utter dog shit. And, well, I would partially agree with you and partially disagree. There are certain scenarios in which this game looks like terrible. It looks like utter horse shit. It doesn't look great at all. But honestly, there are certain areas and things like that, and the overall atmosphere and environment that Ubisoft has designed here and put together is actually pretty interesting. The atmosphere does come together very nicely with the ambient sound and whatnot, and the game does feel pretty polished as in terms of gameplay. Feels pretty good. Aside for that driving though, honestly. So I don't think it's quite as bad as a lot of people like to paint it to be, but regardless of that, hopefully you could get a decent idea of the performance from this video. I never saw the game at the settings that I have, which I will show a screenshot of at some point. I'll probably stick it in the beginning of this video. I've never seen it dropped below 50 FPS at these settings at 1440p, but again, the game should be running at a consistent 60 because clearly it's capable of doing so, since, the restarting method does tend to work most of the time. But regardless of that, I haven't cranked the settings all the way up in the hopes that, that restarting method is going to work. And also, just keep in mind, if you have a lower end processor, you could potentially be seeing a bottleneck there, because this game has some ludicrously high CPU requirements. And that's not even to say that on the recommended system requirements thing on the Steam page or their website, that it doesn't even imply that you need a super high-end CPU on there, but clearly the numbers say something different. So if you can afford it, or if your build has that higher end hardware in it, you're definitely going to benefit from it, at least at the time of release. There could be patches within the coming weeks that significantly lower the strain on your system, but for now, and if Watch Dogs 2 is any indication of how little optimization is actually going to take place, then this is kind of what we're running with for the time being. Anyways, guys, thanks so much for watching this video. I know it was a bit different than my usual shit, and hopefully I didn't swear too many times for your fucking sheltered ears. But hopefully you guys were able to get a decent idea of how this game runs, and sort of help you decide on whether or not you want to purchase it. Now, of course, this isn't an in-depth analysis of the fucking gameplay, but there are tons and tons of other YouTubers out there that have been doing that already. So chances are you didn't really need that, and if you're coming to this video, you're looking more for specific performance. Anyways, thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video.